Well, welcome everybody. It's Bruce Calder. I am here to do a webinar on the EU battery regulation, the basics. I'm not going to go over everything. I'm going to focus mostly on standard batteries and focusing primarily on the 2024 to 2027 timeframe, which I'm going to explain. First, a little about us. By the way, the stuff on the right, this is some student projects from the last couple of years. Now, most of our student projects are very engineering based, like the parts of the new plastic registry process and modeling and new testing. But one of the things they also did is take a whole bunch of the people who work here and put them on, famous record covers, and we have a room. It's called the pets room. I mean, a lot of places have theme rooms, like that's the Hawaii room or whatever. We have a pets room where everybody's pets are up on different pictures on the wall, and that's just one of like 3 walls of pets. So I'm going to have some opening notes about the battery regulation to help put things into context. Some of the confusion and hand waving is because of the structure of the battery regulation. And also why, if you follow certain parts of it to the letter of what's written there, it doesn't work, and why that happened. Then I'll have a synopsis of the requirements. And I'm focusing on normal size battery, things that are 2 kilowatt hours or larger, which have additional requirements, especially in the distant future. That's all webinar on its own. I'm focusing on standard batteries, which the large batteries will have the same these requirements also. And I'm focusing mostly on the 2024 to 2027 timeframe. Things beyond that are still nebulous. A lot of them take standards. And one of the reasons they're pushed out so far is EU is not necessarily certain what they want to do there in the first place. I'm going to talk about materials restrictions and labeling, product labeling. I'm going to talk about CE marking, one of the big changes of bringing batteries into CE marking. I'm going to have an overview of battery labeling at different phases. So I'm going to look at the labeling. There's different label requirements for 2024, 2025, 2026, and 2027. Now, if you're compliant with 2027 requirements, you have all of them. But there actually are new labeling requirements each year throughout to 2027. That's a lot of what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to talk about due diligence related to the critical raw materials, lithium, cobalt, lead, and graphite, and what is required in theory and what is actually happening right now. I'll talk about the label requirements. We'll go on again to 2026 label requirements. Again, there's 2024 requirements, 2025 requirements, 2026 label requirements, and 2027. It keeps evolving. It has a lot to do with the thing I'll talk about in the synopsis section. I'll explain how we do it. We're much more, very, very deliverable oriented. Almost everything we do is what's the deliverable? Awesome. What's the best way to get to that deliverable? This path. Perfect. Let's move along. And then there'll be Q&A. So feel free to submit questions as I go or at the end, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. Okay, so what do we do? So I did some presentations on a variety of things. And often if you try to explain the complicated things about phthalates and stuff like that, people glaze over. So this is a much simpler way of looking at what we do. We prevent ADHD, we prevent cancer, we trace conflict minerals to the warlords in the Congo. And believe it or not, a lot of people on this call, your job actually comprises these two. Somebody asks you at dinner what you do, and you start talking about lead or petroleum retardants. Or if you're working on phthalates, removing phthalates, you're preventing ADHD. If you're getting rid of lead, you're preventing cancer. You're working conflict minerals, you're tracing tin, tantalum, tungsten, gold to the warlords in the Congo. And it sounds a bit cooler than the big chemistry names, but it's actually quite true. A lot of what we do. And we're in the prevention. Almost everything we're doing is the prevention business. It might just seem like regulation to a lot of people. Almost everything is being regulated to prevent something from occurring or to limit the damage caused by things. As opposed to a lot of most medical stuff is around treatment. The bad things already happened. Now we're going to try to treat it. The vast majority of money in the world is on treatment. Prevention is very little money, but a lot of what we're dealing with is the prevention side. It is a more niche. I'm kind of a big fan of the prevention side. Like, let's not actually have ADHD or Alzheimer's. Like Alzheimer's and ADHD are 2 of the most preventable things around. Cancer is a bit more complicated. ADHD and Alzheimer's are very, very preventable things, or at least a delayable in the Alzheimer's situation. They just have to spend the effort doing it there instead of all the treatment afterwards. So what do we do ourselves? We do a lot of consulting, like this kind of thing. Our most popular service by far, I think we do it for over 100 companies right now, is we sit down every quarter and explain the changes in restricted materials and how they apply to your products, or in some cases don't. Or here's new chemicals. Turns out, like the new adaptation of technical progress for medical devices, 22 of the 9 substances, I think, that would affect medical devices, only one is potentially a problem and in a very limited situation, which will explain for people doing monthlies and quarterly updates, we'll explain that. Sure, we'll talk about complicated things about the half-life of peroxides and why certain chemicals aren't a problem. And that's a lot for people to understand. But the answer is this new SVHC or new substance can't be in your product at a regulated level because of this reason. Lots of consulting, or tremendous amount of testing, especially complex products. Huge amount of testing. We definitely are top players in complex products for sure. For PFAS, plastics registry, there's no comparison. But also the RHS, the REACH, POP, all those sort of things. And then a lot of due diligence. And we're, as far as we're ahead in testing, we're so much farther ahead in due diligence for conflict minerals or for batteries. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And it's not even remotely close on the due diligence side. EU battery regulation, which is the topic for today, is published in July of 2023. And again, if you see that kind of hyperlinked, underlined, that's hyperlinked. So when you get the slides, which everybody who registered will get the copy of the slides, you can just click on it. And go there. The requirements are phased in and focus a lot on larger batteries. It's funny, that's the ones we're not talking about it, the larger batteries. They have, it's like, you can have a whole additional webinar on that thing. I'll talk about that in a moment. Now, first opening comment, this helps explain the entire situation. This is a bad sign for any legislation. It has 24 pages of preamble, not requirements, not definitions, not things you have to do, preamble on the things they're trying to do. There are 143 things they were trying to do. That's a lot. The REACH regulation has less. The REACH regulation is the entire rewrite of the chemical management, protection, registration, authorization, restriction system for all chemicals in Europe. And it has less preamble. They were trying to accomplish less things than this was. This is just batteries. There was a lot of chefs in the kitchen. Some of these chefs should not have been in the kitchen. Some of these are like, the first time when they go away to school and their mom has been cooking all their lives. Like one of the fellows, an engineer, and he's probably a very good technical engineer I live with just post-university. He invited his parents over for dinner, and I was living with him at the time. He's like, hey, do you want to come to dinner with my parents? And I'm like, sure. And he's like, I'm going to make dinner. I'm like, okay, I've never seen you do that before, but let's go with it. So he got ground beef, which often is a very good start to any dinner. And it was in like one of those styrofoam little trays. You put the plastic wrap on. Took the plastic wrap off, and he put the tray of ground beef in the microwave and hit it for an X number of minutes. I'm like, well, what kind of recipe is that for? No, that's the meat. I'm like, we're just going to microwave the ground beef on the styrofoam. All right, whatever. And I taught him, so the idea is for making scalloped potatoes. You cut up some potatoes, you put it with butter, a bunch of vegetables in a pot, and you cook them till the potatoes are soft. Well, he did all that, but then he got creative, and he wasn't really talented, like had any idea what he was doing. So instead of salt and pepper, he started putting dill in, and he didn't actually cook the potatoes long enough for the butter to actually melt, which is definitely undercooked potatoes. Because we're using butter in it to help cook it, and the butter wasn't even melted. So I'm getting served, and I got my little quarter of microwaved ground beef. And it's neat because it's really easy to scoop off the styrofoam container as long as you don't cut it too while you're taking the piece off. And then I got my potato slices that are quite raw, and I mean the butter is still unmelted on them. And then he used dill as a seasoning, which was something. And his parents are complimenting the whole time. I guess the first time they've seen him cook, and I'm just looking at this. So that story, the battery regulation, reminds me of that story to a certain extent. There are some people in that kitchen and the chefs creating the battery regulation that probably shouldn't have been there. Everybody was trying to achieve something, and there are a lot of chefs, and some of them probably shouldn't have been in the kitchen. It was some months later that we realized that we did think he was cooking soup every day, and it turns out he wasn't actually cooking soup. He was just heating the soup up because he had ingrown toenail and pus going. He was just soaking his foot in our one soup pot every day, not telling us for months. Anyways, on to other stories. Yeah. So all of that reminds me, the battery regulation reminds me of that roommate. These are not necessarily people that may or may not have should be doing this. The EU battery regulation is 117 pages. That's a lot. That's all I take in. So often, some of the industry associations try to distill down a simplified version. And when they actually try to distill it, they're like, some of this doesn't actually work right. And they're trying to achieve a lot of things. So there's certain sections that have the exact same requirements, but there are separate lines like thou shalt do this. In the later section, thou shalt do this. It's the same thing. It's because they're written as different requirements. So it's 117 pages in French. Well, growing up, where all my schooling growing up was in French, once I moved back to Canada, I did grow up in Chicago, which is a bit different. My schooling was in French, so all my kids. You learn pretty quickly that the same thing written in French that was written in English are not the same size. You ever look at the back of a cereal box in Canada? The French section's like twice the size. How the BU battery regulation is also 117 pages in French and 117 pages in English defies all logic. It's like at a certain point they went, that section's for the English folk. We won't do it. It's always an interesting part. So today, of the 117 pages, I'm going to focus on 2024 to 2025. 2028, I wouldn't say it can take care of itself. It factors out in 2028 means Europe is not necessarily sure what they're doing for some of these things. Again, it's one of the chefs thought of an idea. And I wouldn't necessarily say the overall concept of some of the ideas is a good or bad idea. Some of them are not bad, they're not bad ideas. They just didn't know how to do it. That's a challenge. One of the reasons why some of them are out in 2028, 2030 is they didn't really know how to do it. And that might have been something they could have spent a little more effort on. However, the battery regulations are only updated basically every 15 years or so. I can see why they just tried to jam everything in. They could not wait another 1.5 decades. So I'm also focusing on batteries under 2 kilowatt hours. The ones over 2 kilowatt hours, the big, large industrial ones, car batteries, server batteries, etc., have more requirements. And those are mostly post 2027 anyways. Carbon footprint and recycled material content. That's a whole extra webinar. Doing those or including in the big batteries or beyond 2027 would double the length of the webinar and really, dilute the focus on what has to be done for most batteries between 2024 and 2027. Let's focus on the now or close enough to now. And realistically, beyond 2027, it's unlikely that EU knows for 100% surety, 50% surety, that what they're doing on these subjects on the big batteries in post 2028. It's a whole bunch of good stuff like, hey, we're going to create a standard, or there's going to be some notified bodies. I don't really know what that looks like right now. We're doing carbon footprints. It seems like a good idea, but we're not really sure how we're going to do it at this point in time. So they're later. So again, we're focusing on 2024 to 2027. That's why this is the EU battery regulation basics, but the basics are still all of that. So this is what we're focusing on today. And as I said, I could add more. It's 117 pages, even though only 24 of it's preamble. It's still, 90 some pages of content. And only 1 or 2 are pictures, I still have to focus on all this. And I'm going to get back to all this. I'm not going to try to read it right now and you follow along your head where I'm at. Don't worry, I'm going to do this in a much more organized manner. But this is also this is what the content I'm talking about today. There's a lot going on. Overall synopsis, though, instead of those line items, it's really 3 things. It's things that already existed in the EU battery directive. The battery regulation is stuff that already existed in the battery regulation, battery directive. Some of the things are really funny. Like in 2025, thou shalt, put the wheelie bin on. You've had to do that for a decade. Why is that a 2020? Whatever. That's a 2025 requirement. Has it to do also with whoever the chefs are. It's like they got to write their own sections. Somebody wrote the CE mark section. Somebody wrote the restricted material section, etc. And they're different sections. And that's why the dates are not necessarily congruent to the fact you've already had to put the wheelie bin on your battery for the last decade. It's moving into CE marking, which is a new thing. And there's a whole section and the requirements related to CE marking. And there's a bunch of new stuff. So the requirements from the previous EU battery directive are phasing in 2024 and beyond. It's funny, some of the requirements that are currently already required under the battery directive are phasing in 2025 in the battery regulation. I'm like, does that give you like a 1.5 year grace to not do it anymore? I don't know. The CE marking is 2024, and there's a bunch of new stuff 2025 and beyond. I'll talk about a bunch of the new stuff that's for regular batteries from 2025 to 2027. And that's kind of the way to structurally look at it. There's stuff that's always been there. It's just been reemphasized. Some companies are like, I've had to do that. Oh my goodness, when do I have to, put the wheelie bin on? You've had to do that for at least 10 years, maybe 15. There's CE marking in 2024 and all of its requirements, and there's a bunch of new stuff in 2025 and beyond. So opening, in terms of stuff you've always had to do battery reporting and collection. Treat it like we you do your battery collection reporting in the same countries you do for we, doing electronics. Over oversimplification. If you're the importer of the product for sale to the customer in that country, not the EU, it's country based for this, then you have to report and collect. If you're over 1 ton a year of electronics and batteries, there's a lot more grace around it. You technically have to, but there's really no penalty for not reporting if you're under 1 ton total of batteries and electronics. But think it also as being taxation. So if the distributor is handling that country, like VAT and taxation, they should also be handling the reporting collection. And generally, your distributor is the importer into that country, even though they're not, because EU is a common market, they're not bringing it into France because in the EU because it's already in Germany. But from this perspective, if they're the ones bringing it into France, the distributor in France, they're responsible for it. And that's a whole complicated thing, especially when you're selling directly to the end user, which we can cover another time. But whatever you're doing today, you're doing it right, it continues. And think of it as if you're doing we and you have batteries, your batteries also need reporting and collection, hopefully in the same system you're doing. For those your batteries only, sure, you probably choosing a battery system. For most people who are selling batteries, they're part of electronics or with electronics or for electronics, and they already have we requirements. For electronics, you have to have their cadmium and lead marking if you have NiCad or lead acid batteries. It starts in February of this year. That's been around for a decade, part of the battery directive, so nothing really new. There are some materials restrictions. Those are also, except for there seems to be a typo. And we brought it up to them. And they basically said, hey, lead in portable batteries should not be over 0.01% lead. We told them, you mean the battery cell, because the cutoff circuitry for lithium batteries that helps it from blowing up and doing things that the regulation says they shouldn't do or fly on planes, they need a circuitry to prevent that from happening. Those circuitries use ROHS compliant leaded glass resistors. They have leaded glass in them. They would not meet that 0.01%. So we're assuming we told them, this has to be battery cells. Otherwise, you've banned lithium batteries. You've banned electric cars. In August 2024, you've banned all electric cars because you can't have the circuitry you need to make the electric car battery safe. So we're assuming it's the battery cell, not the overall battery pack. So, well, it says batteries, and if you look at portable batteries, the definition, yes. Again, not all these chefs are necessarily maybe qualified to be in there. Let's get rid of lead in batteries. It's like, well, you have the circuitry. Maybe you say, hey, cannot contain more than 0.01% by weight, not excluding or exempting ROHS compliant electronic components used for safety or other circuitry. Sure, that should have been blatantly obvious when they did it. And NiCad, portable batteries should not be above 0.002% cadmium. So basically, you can't have nickel cadmium batteries, except for an industrial situation. That's been around for a bit. And of course, lithium are more and more in the industrial situation anyways. And mercury, the battery cell, can't have mercury. The main source of mercury we see most products, a little puffy sticker. Like if your brand has a puffy sticker, like I would have thought of like the old Smurf sticker, the old polyurethane puffy sticker. They're blowing agents mercury based. We're assuming this means the cell and doesn't include any sticker labels on the outside. So these are the material restrictions, which basically, other than the general portable battery restriction in August 2024, they've been around since the battery directive. Like these are actually not really a change in the battery directive. The only difference is they say batteries, not battery cells, and that looks to be a bit of a mistake. So again, non-portable batteries can have cadmium, but require the cadmium label. So you can have NiCad in industrial batteries, but you have to put a cadmium label on it. Same thing. You can have, lead acid batteries for your car, but they have to have the lead. They're not portable batteries. Then you have to have the lead label. So there's restrictions, and where there isn't restrictions for cadmium and lead, you have to put the lead or cadmium on the label. One of the big changes in the battery regulation is the adoption of CE marking. So battery regulated directive didn't have CE marking. It's like ROHS back in 2015 came into CE marking. Battery regulations now moving into CE marking. And the CE mark is you have to do a conformity assessment, which right now for standard batteries is just doesn't have the label and doesn't meet the materials restrictions. That's it. Later on, there's gonna be more requirements post 2027, and the bigger batteries will have things like critical raw materials and carbon footprint, stuff like that, but that's out in the future. You have to do a declaration conformity. So if your battery will need a declaration conformity now if you sell it by itself. But if it's in electronics, your electronics has a declaration of conformity usually. If you plug it in the wall for low voltage directive, EMC, ROHS, etc., you have to add the battery regulation to your declaration of conformity. And this is as of August 2024, it's a couple months ago. Now, so you might not be in compliance right now. However, if the customs broker is not asking for it, then nothing's stopping it. But do realize at any instant they can realize if you have a battery, you're supposed to have the battery regulation as part of CE marking in your product's declaration conformity, or have its own. Either one is fine. That has to happen. You have to apply the CE mark. You also need the technical file, which is the conformity assessment. It's really easy right now. It's basically, have you checked the labels? So we do it for lots of companies. Do the labels meet the requirements, and do you meet the materials restrictions? You have to apply the CE mark. The CE mark is more complicated than people think. They're like, hey, I put CE on. It's the CE mark. There's actually 4 marks. When you do CE marking, there are 4 marks. And the deadline's August 2024, which passed a couple months ago. So realize that your products are in CE marking and have to comply. So these are the main 2024 requirements. So when I talk about the new 2024 requirements, it's primarily the fact that CE marking alcohol. So for CE marking, it's more than that. You have to have the CE mark, and it has to be to the size and proportions. So that C, if you completed it, it would be a perfect circle. It would go through the back of the E, and the middle of the E has to be receded. That's actually one of the biggest mistakes. The middle of the E has to be receded, as you can see here in this picture. You have to have the name or brand of the manufacturer. Okay. By the way, that's been needed for some time. So this is the company responsible for compliance. Technically, the company that's holding the bag is the importer into the EU. They're the ones who are actually legally responsible to making sure compliance happened, but they're legally responsible to make sure the brand owner. So it doesn't matter who made it. The manufacturer in Europe is the entity that puts the brand on the product for sale. And that's what they see as the manufacturer. The importer is one legally responsible to making sure all the compliance has occurred, but the manufacturer is the label that goes on. The address of the manufacturer, that's missed all the time. That's part of CE marking. Like your product needs an address they can contact, like send a post, a snail mail to you. It can't be you can add a website also, but website's not sufficient because it could move. That might change in the future, and it is changing in some regulations. Your website would be sufficient, but imagine, you probably had a time or two where you've been acquired someone else, and their website changed. That's more of a problem. And people are like, well, our address changes less frequently than usual. Your website and your model or serial number, that also has to be there. There are 4 things that have to be on there. That's CE marking. You need all 4. And that's the 2024 labeling requirement. The deadline's August 2024. This could be a sticker. By the way, if the battery is too small or the form or fit or function does not allow these 4 things, they can be in the accompanying documentation. They can be on the packaging. They could be an insert. They could be in a manual, whichever. You just have to justify that I can't put the CE mark on it and the name and brand of manufacturer and the address, or it could just be a subset. I can put everything on but the address. So I'll put another comment about the battery, about CE marking in the manual that has our address. So you have to make sure the address of the manufacturer. And that could be in the accompanying documentation of the battery or the product the battery's in. So lots of stuff today. Now it's the CE mark, which also has the model number and manufacturer label. You need a technical file, which is that conformity assessment. By the way, I just changed the thing here, and you notice the animation's not quite lining up. When you get the final version of this, it will line up. I added something in to try to be extra intelligent and smart. Basically, something in the morning I noticed, I'd rather label it this way, and I didn't fix the animation on this one. So how we, Claigan, handle battery regulation. We do reviews of SDS and test the battery cells for the materials restrictions. So we review and test for materials restrictions. Sometimes there's no point testing, like they blatantly tell you it's lead acid. I'm not testing for it's lead acid battery. That's fine. We review against the 2024 labeling requirements, tell you if you're compliant or where you're deficient and how to fix it. A lot of it's how to fix it. We review against the 2025 requirements. As I mentioned, the labeling requirements, there are 2024 requirements. There are additional requirements in 2025. We review against the additional requirements in 2026, and there's another one in 2027. Now, I'll go over them here, but there are labeling requirements. And if you meet the 2027 requirements, you meet everything before that. But we do it in a stepwise process to tell you, like, you're not compliant right now, or you're not compliant in 2025, and this is what you have to do. Like, for example, same battery. I just took this one off the web. If it's your battery, sorry, we picked the first one. Are they compliant for CE marking? No, They're like, well, it's a CE mark, the right shape. No, the CE mark has a lot more rules, and I've only gone over pieces of it here, and it's actually even more than I'm going to talk about. But it has to be at least 3% of the surface area of that one side, up to a maximum of 5 millimeters. If it's 5 millimeters, that's fine. It's not. So it's not 3% of the surface area, and it's not 3 millimeters. So, or 5 millimeters. So it's not compliant. So this is currently not compliant with the CE requirements. It does have the name of the manufacturer there, which is really good. The address of the manufacturer, nope, doesn't have that. So it doesn't meet CE. You have to have the address of the manufacturer. Now, it could be a company documentation. And so I'm just doing this from this picture. It has the model serial number right there, and it's not a lead cadmium battery, so you don't have to put that on it. So for us, we'd say, hey, this is what's missing, the CE mark. And we explained there'd be a comment section saying, this is what you have to do for the CE mark and that. And you're missing the address of the manufacturer, and this is what you have to do. And we do that for the 2024, 2025, 2026, and 2027. And we do it, if you're testing for other things, we do it often in parallel, but we can do your batteries separately on their own. It's pretty simple, very organized. You also get a very simple report, tells you exactly what to do. Not necessarily you're the person doing it, but you can give it to the person who has to do labeling and saying, here's the problem, you fix it. So again, topics today are somewhat limited. 2025, you have the crossed out trash bin or wheelie bin, which is funny because you've always had to do it for the last decade. But because the section it's in the regulation doesn't kick in until August 2025, you don't have to do the wheelie bin for the battery regulation until 2025. Though you've had to do it for the battery directive for the past decade or more. There will be additional labeling requirements in 2026. I'll explain in a bit. So first of all, wheelie bin. Crossed out wheelie bin. It is similar to the WE one. It's actually not the same symbol. The WE symbol is two symbols. Most people don't realize. But, oh, by the way, I didn't mention earlier. A couple of things. All of our previous webinars are up on YouTube. You go Claigan YouTube, and magically you'll find us. And all of our webinars are there. And sometimes you can slow me down so I make a little more sense, maybe. And strange enough, YouTube often annotates it so you can skip to certain topics. It's amazing what it does. So that's all for the stuff we've been doing in webinars, which is all new requirements. What we're also doing starting in the end of November is we do internally lunch and learns, where people get fed, which unfortunately through YouTube we won't feed you. You won't have an Uber show up during the webinar. However, that would be an awesome addition to any service. No, we do lunch and learns internally where we explain legacy things. So the one we're going to do at the end of November is ROHS. And ROHS at a level people probably aren't aware of. We're going to do it. I've done it for 20 years. I explain a lot of the things that happen early on. And it explains so much why it's the way it is right now and why it's going to change again soon. And why the ROHS exemptions get bogged up all the time compared to REACH SVHCs, which are right on schedule. It has to do with the structure and how it started and how ROHS was an accident. They never meant to make it, and how it got created and why this all happened, and why CE marking wasn't part of it, and why DECA BDE was not a banned substance originally, and what happened and why it became a banned substance under ROHS, and a whole bunch of stuff. And it's good because so even people who've done ROHS for a long time, it'll be really interesting. You can play it in the background, but also you may have other stakeholders. You want to bring them up to speed. We're also using internally as part of our process to sign off a lot of our technical people that they've had additional education on these individual topics. They're quite complicated, and by the way, when you ever do a test report with us, there's always an engineer that's delivered to you. Feel free to ask them to explain everything to you. It's part of the service, actually. They'll offer to. Usually, but feel free to take them up on it. They'll explain a lot. But we have to keep them up to speed in all the fine points, not just the test data result. So it's what we do internally. So we're going to have a lunch and learn series on our YouTube site too, where a lot of the legacy ones, lunch and learn will come out there. So one of the weird legacy ones is this label is not the same as WE's, even though it looks very similar. The WE label for it's actually two labels. You're like, well, WE is only one label. It's actually two. You're just used to being on the same sticker. So the WE label has this, the crossed out wheelie bin, which actually is allowed some artistic license as long as you can understand it, unlike CE mark, which is not allowed any artistic license. And WE has a dark block, a square, a line underneath it. That line means the product was placed on the market in Europe after August 13th, 2005, which is basically all products now, obviously. It's two labels. The date label based on whether a collection, recycling collection applied to it or didn't. Battery regulation doesn't have that bar, so it just has the crossed out wheelie bin. Same crossed out wheelie bin, it just doesn't have the bar underneath it. That's a WE only thing. That's a second label. WE has two labels to it, not just one. They look like one, and when you get on the sticker, it seems like one, but it's actually two labels. So again, if your battery is too small, which a lot of people have argued that coin cell batteries are too small, which I don't agree, but you can put this in the accompanying documentation. So if the form, fit, size, function do not fit the wheelie bin, you can put in the accompanying documentation. You could also put it on the battery as a sticker. That's all viable. And that's August 2025, even though you've had to have this for the last decade. There's a bunch of rules on what size it has to be and depending on your battery type, and we can help with that as part of our battery labeling review. That's the 2025 requirements. I'm going to talk about 2026 labeling in a touch, but I'm going to talk about 2025 because there's this due diligence thing. I'm going to talk about this mess. And so if anyone places batteries in the market in the EU, including inside electronics, and has an annual sales over 40 million euros per year, which seems to drag a lot of companies in. And you have to complete due diligence on the critical raw materials: cobalt, nickel, lead, and graphite. I was about to say tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. That's conflict minerals. Very similar system. So you have to do due diligence and be reviewed by a notified body. And I'll explain the details of using the extended materials reporting template and then doing the due diligence afterwards. Technically, I'll show you in a minute, two things. You have to trace back. It's called the traceability. That's what this EMRT does. And then you have the due diligence, which the EMRT does not. Same thing as conflict minerals. CMRT for conflict minerals as a tracing, it does not do the due diligence. That is separate. That's mandatory, but it's separate requirement. So it's very conflict minerals like. The form looks very similar, but it's different. The EMRT in April will have all the battery regulation substances. Right now, it's a combination of two, EMRT and there's an AMRT. So when we do battery regulation due diligence right now for companies, we have to use two different templates. By April next year, it should be one. And the guidance on how to do diligence is supposed to be released February 2025. But we don't even have the draft version yet. And the consultant doing it is also selling services for it, which seems like an odd conflict of interest. I'm not involved in it, but it seems very odd. So this is something you'll get done by August of next year, and it has to be reviewed by a notified body. And we don't even have guidance how to do it. And if you look up the notified bodies for the battery regulation right now, there are none. So that part's going to change. I expect the notified body requirement will be delayed and definitely reduced for which company to go. Due diligence will happen, but the actual notified body part I expect to be reduced. Again, I don't think everybody involved knew what they were doing, hadn't thought everything through. Again, you have 143 comments of what they're trying to accomplish. You realize things are going to go sideways. But everybody will have to do due diligence. We just don't know how much. Due diligence is you have to adopt and clearly communicate to suppliers a company battery due diligence policy. Conflict minerals is the same thing about conflict minerals. Incorporate its battery due diligence policy standards with the standards set out, an internationally recognized due diligence instrument. They mean the OECD guidance. They can't actually say has to be the OECD guidance, but that's what they mean, i.e. the OECD due diligence. And you have to structure its internal management system to support its battery due diligence policy. Almost everything on this page is sort of hand wavy, have a policy, code of ethics thing. Note, the due diligence are related to currently 4 materials. They can add more in the future: cobalt in your batteries, lithium in your batteries, natural graphite in the batteries, and nickel in your battery. Now we're assuming it's the battery cell. We're assuming it does include nickel in the electrodes of the battery pack. I don't think that's what they meant. And they may clarify that. These substances, by the way, will have label requirements on your battery in 2026. So there's a due diligence 2025 and there's a labeling requirement 2026. I'll talk about it in a moment. Back at the due diligence, you have to establish and operate a system of controls and transparency regarding the supply chain. So the system, and I'll talk about system, this is the key thing. And you have to incorporate battery due diligence policy into contracts and agreements with suppliers. Fine. Establish a grievance mechanism. Sure. The system one is the fundamentally important one. The system has to have a description of the raw materials, which are the 4 critical ones, 1, 2, 3, or 4 you have in your products. The name and address of your supplier of those batteries, that's easy. The country of origin of the raw material and the market transaction. So it's really country of origin of the raw material and identity of the supplier of the battery. So this can be handled with the EMRT/AMRT combination this year, next year the EMRT alone. It can do the traceability. You have to have the quantity of raw material present in the battery. Then, so this is more the traceability of what's in your battery. Then you can use any third-party verification reports issued by a notified body. So this is like the conflict-free stuff, but for EMRT, but they don't exist yet. The notified bodies don't exist. If the notified body reports are not available, which is for every situation right now, you have to do the OECD due diligence on the source. So EMRT is not due diligence, it's traceability. You have to do the EMRT for traceability, then you do the due diligence. So you basically have to do the EMRT for traceability, that's traceability. The one in 20, so you have to do it in 2025. The one in April will do the job. If you want to get an early head start, the current EMRT AMRT combo, which if you're working through us, you won't even notice it. In fact, there are two, not one. It's relatively straightforward. This is the minerals traceability part, not the due diligence. Like CMRT for conflict minerals is not due diligence. That's traceability. Due diligence is on the refinery. EMRT is on the mines and the refineries. Sorry, the due diligence. So you have to do the EMRT first, and then when you identify the refineries or sources of the four critical raw materials, you have to do the due diligence in 2025. So, and you have to monitor additional guidance from the EU. But right now, it's really, you use the EMRT. You don't have to use the EMRT. It's kind of ridiculous not to use the system that everybody else uses. Then when you find out where your stuff is from, which will be a lot fewer places than conflict minerals, battery regulations are battery manufacturers very vertical and less incestuous. They don't sell pieces to each other back and forth. So conflict minerals, because everybody sells things to everybody else, the refinery list gets everything in it because it's so incestuous. Battery is not, it's much more vertical. So when of the, less probably dozens of sources you have total for the batteries, refineries, and mines, you have to do due diligence on. Really just come to us. We're the best in the world at this. We're so far ahead on the due diligence. That's something we do for a long time. We've already done a lot of the due diligence work on batteries. We're the leader in battery due diligence. We've identified the source is conducting due diligence for nearly 500 mines and refiners of nickel, cobalt, graphite, lithium for batteries. Now, what's in your supply chain may end up being dozens, might be as high as 100. We do it, the full thing for everything. And it's a huge amount of work, but if you're working with us, you're just paying a small fraction. In fact, we do this for everybody. It's like conflict minerals. Our due diligence is second to none. There's a lot more conflict-free type of certification audits now, which reduce the number of refineries that need due diligence. Here, everything needs due diligence, and it's a wide open. And it's more than your standard Democratic Republic of Congo. It's a much larger group of things. We've done all that. So that's all, or in the process of doing all that. So when in doubt, reach out to us. We can just do it. It is technically complicated. It's very complicated stuff. Now, again, the topics today, there was a battery labeling requirement 2026. So I talked about 2024, 2025 label, 2026 label. It's in part A, the Annex 6, August, due date August 2020. August 18th, 2026, unless you have to put it on the battery, unless the form or fit or form or function size don't allow it. Then it can be in the packaging or accompanying documentation. And that's this stuff. And I probably should have made it a bigger font, but this is the way it comes in the regulation. So you have to have the identity of the manufacturer, which you've had to have for CE marking already. So it's one of those things like, this is a different section, asking the exact same thing that you already had to do in another section. The battery category and information of battery accordance Article 38.6, which you wouldn't intuitively know this is the address of the battery manufacturer. That's Article 38.6 is the address. Why doesn't it say address? I don't know. Place the manufacturer of the battery manufacturing plant, which may or may not be the same as the brand owners, the manufacturer's address. Date of manufacture, month and year. Weight, capacity, chemistry, and other hazardous substances present in the battery other than mercury, cadmium, or lead. These aren't any hazardous substances. No, it has to be added to the battery regulation as a regulated substance, which the European Chemical Agency can, like the SVHC process, add them. But until they're added, it's just mercury, cadmium, and lead, which already have restrictions and labeling requirements. It's just if something new comes along and they say, hey, we're going to now say there's label requirements for DHP, this would force you to label it. Usable extinguishing agent, which is a new thing, kind of makes sense actually. And the critical raw materials, which I just talked about for due diligence, nickel, cobalt, lead, and natural graphite, if they're about 0.1% by weight, and we assume they mean battery cell, not battery, because we're not including the little steel electrodes, you have to put that, it has lithium and cobalt on the actual label in 2026. Again, if the label is not big enough for some of it or all of it, it can be in the accompanying documentation. Plus, non-rechargeable batteries have something that's actually kind of makes sense. First, say it's non-rechargeable. That's pretty mundane. What's the minimum hours of average duration? That's a pretty neat idea, because when you're buying a battery for whatever dollars in the AAA's, people say, hey, they have like, little, animatronic bunnies with things and says mine lasts longer. No, actually have a number. That would be pretty good. And so you can compare if I'm buying one at the dollar store for, $1.50 versus the $8 one at the drugstore. Is there a difference? Usually there is, actually. So they have to put the minimum hours of average duration on there. That's 2026, and that's non-rechargeable. You don't have to, you can put capacity and such on the rechargeable, but non-rechargeable has the average duration. So again, lots of other stuff today. In 2027, there's also a QR code, which we're not going into too much today. It's going to be a link to all those things we talked about in the label. You can put them in a QR code, because it, as I said, if the battery won't fit it, those zillion things, you can put it in the accompanying documentation. That can move to a QR code. So it's the battery labels information, and which includes, do you have lead or cadmium in it, they get to move to a QR code instead of having to label the whole thing, especially if it won't fit. If it fits, it looks like you still have to put it on and the QR code. There are also more advanced requirements for larger batteries in the future: carbon footprint, recyclable amount of percent recycled materials, etc. Those will be part of a battery passport, which the QR code will go to also. But it's only big batteries, and that's farther in the future, and that's a topic for another webinar. But the QR code will go to your battery information, which is mostly initially just labeling and materials restrictions. That's 2027. Also in 2027, there's going to be new standards for removability and replaceability of batteries. However, medical imaging devices and any device exposed to water, which are assuming blood counts, don't have to have removability or replaceability. Or if continuous power supply is important, like a pacemaker, it doesn't have to be removable. There will be rules and guidance of what can be professionally removed, like by a repair technician versus the end user. Those standards have a while to be built. So 2027, so we're talking about it. What the rules are, we don't know yet. Basically, if you have to be watertight because of water or blood, then you have to do this no matter what. There will be standards in the future. When will be on time? Probably not. So standards to be developed. So again, how we handle it: give us your battery. We can review or test for materials restrictions. We'll test at the cell level. Then we'll review against the 2024 battery label requirements of 2025, 2026, 2027, and spell it out for you. So any new project with us, like testing, has this, but we can do it in any. If you have any batteries, hey, I need to be able to identify to my packaging and labeling, or my product managers, or whatever product line managers, what I have to do. Just give us your battery, and we can do all this. And identify, and you could be fully compliant, but if you're not, this is what you're going to have to do to bring that to compliance. So our approach to battery regulation: we test battery cells for materials restrictions. We review battery labeling. Now, we don't necessarily test a lead acid battery for lead, because lead acid battery, we'll put the lead label on it. We review battery label requirements, the 2024 requirements, 2025 requirements, 2026 requirements, and 2027 requirements. And we provide the technical documentation support for the above. So you get your technical file for the above. I'm going to update that before we set out the presentation. And we do the MRT-based traceability of the origin of the critical materials. We can do it now using the 2 template version, or if you want to do the single one, doesn't change the cost actually. Working with us, we use the single one next April, and we are the source for due diligence on the critical materials. So even if you did your own traceability, it's a little easier than conflict minerals, because you're only really focusing on your batteries suppliers. It is a little bit tricky if you're a larger company, where you may have products you get with batteries in them, and how to include those companies into it. You try to do the best to make sure they're included in this due diligence. But it's really only, you can limit it to batteries or products with batteries in it. That's the traceability, and then we do the traceability and we do the due diligence. So we can do the whole thing for you. It's generally a lot lower effort, most of it, than the conflict minerals. Limited number of suppliers, more vertical supply chain, less sources. Even though there are over 500 sources of lithium, cobalt, lead, and graphite that go into batteries, realistically, because the supply chains are very vertical, it ends up being dozens or maybe 100 for you. Now Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the control panel. I'll try to get to as many as possible. and I'll probably click a button in a moment that'll make weird things happen. So like this morning, I said, I'm just not going to click the button because it always goes wrong. And then 2 seconds later, click the button. It's like when I was in university. It's way back far enough that when we dialed in for our email, we had to dial in. It's a modem. No, and my roommates always yell out, don't lift up the phone. We're doing email. And then I'm like, okay, I can't use the phone. What am I going to do? I'm bored. I wonder what John's doing when I pick up the phone. And then it'll cut the bottom. Yeah. So that's like me in the Q&A section. I'm going to have this whole conversation, which is a story to help me remember. I'm literally going to click it. It's going to do something funny. For the CE mark, is only that for the battery itself, or does the CE mark need to be on the product the battery is in it well? So the product may have CE marking requirements of its own. If it does, then yes, but that's its own. So if it's inside an electronic device with its own CE marking requirements, it needs CE too, but for its own reasons. The CE is just for the battery and won't fit in the battery. It can be accompanying documentation. The product, if it's inside a product, it might have its own CE requirements, but its labeling on the product would have to be for itself, not the battery. They don't want you putting the CE marking really on the product and only mean the battery. They want the CE mark in the product to refer to the product. The battery needs its own. To clarify, if the required battery info and marking is in the QR code link, then that info can be removed from the label and just rely on the QR code. It doesn't say that. We believe so, but we're not sure actually. But in most cases, that label is so massive, it won't fit anyways. So it's going to be the accompanying documentation. It's mostly going to replace the accompanying documentation version, but we'll see. There might be clarification. That one's out in 2027, and we do expect some clarifications on the QR code. It would make sense. It might make sense for it to replace it. It's likely going to replace some of it, but they might say you still have to keep this, that, and the other thing on the battery if there's space. So we don't know for sure. So technically, no, it can't replace what's on it. But what the label needs to, by 2020, needs to put on the battery, maybe a lot more than the battery can handle. And most things are in accompanying documentation anyways, and the QR code makes sense. If you're buying batteries from a battery manufacturer and incorporate them into our products, you still need to do all the steps for due diligence. Technically, yes. However, you can ask, if you're over the 40 million of sales in Europe, euros. However, you can ask the supplier for everything they have. You still have to have the program due diligence. It's kind of like conflict minerals. You still have to have everything, but the actual traceability and due diligence may have been handled by your supplier if they give it to you. Now, of course, if it's one battery supplier, you're literally doing the traceability of one battery supplier. It's really easy. Just get the EMRT for them, and then you can ask them for the due diligence, or you might have to do it yourself. That's a good question. That's one of the reasons that also sort of thing that should end up in contract, because the battery suppliers should have a better knowledge depending where they're from. The question, so if there's a button cell product being used in a larger product, the button cell is large enough for the labeling. Does the information to be included in the product documentation? It needs to be in the accompanying documentation, whatever you deem that is. So yeah, so all that CE marking, battery label, CE, everything needs to be in the accompanying documentation, which could be a manual, could be an insert, could be on the outside packaging of the entire product. It's allowed actually. This has to be with it. Do we have to exchange certificates based on the new regulations? No, it's not like ROHS certificate of compliance. There's a declaration of conformity. So when you're importing a battery or a product with a battery in it, you'll need a declaration of conformity. Most of your electronic products containing batteries already have a declaration of conformity requirement. You just have to add the battery regulation to it. So it's declaration conformity level, finished product level, not certificates of compliance being exchanged. Do all the batteries require a passport? I didn't bring up the passports today because they're all related to later dates of larger batteries. Batteries under 2 kilowatt hours in general don't need passports. There may be an exception in the far distant future. Their requirements up to 2027 are very limited here. So they don't specifically need the battery passport, the carbon footprint, recycled material content, stuff like that, which is a whole extra webinar for big batteries. We wanted to start with the basics for everyone else. The passports, by and large, don't apply in any real near term to normal batteries, just the big ones, and that's later anyways. And the passport is just a fancy word for a big technical documentation for the consumer or user. Again, everybody who registered will receive a copy of the slides. I'm going to make a little fix. The technical support for the above is not the best language there. And everybody who registered will receive a copy of the slides, and there will be a recording available on our YouTube site. So just go Claigan YouTube and you'll find us. for the next couple of days, and all of our stuff's there with a lot of views. Actually, it's kind of neat. There will be, probably by the start of December, the new Lunch and Learn series will be going up there, which is mostly legacy stuff like ROHS and reach restriction. Oh, there's one more question. Hello, we have a battery that happens to be a component that we add specification to an external enclosure, and a high-level specification of internal parts since the battery is not a core business. The battery manufacturer owns the guts of the battery used on our device. Who owns the creation of the tech file? So ultimately, it depends who brand's on it. So if it's there, so if you're the one importing it, you're responsible to make sure it occurs. The one who's responsible doing the tech file and DOC is the one whose name is on it. So whose name is on it? Who is the manufacturer? Basically, who's placing whatever the battery is. And if it's complicated, we can always reach out to if it's complicated what the battery is. Who is placing on the market the battery under their own name? If so, they're responsible for a lot of the requirements. However, if you're importing, you're making sure it's happening. And if it's inside your product, yes, it has to be added to your declaration of conformity. You have to make sure that if it's part of your product, that your product meets the requirements of battery regulation. It's part of placing on the market the electrical device with the battery in it. Does the EU battery regulation restrict NiCad and batteries? Yes, in portable batteries. Industrial batteries, no. And whether your product's an industrial battery or portable battery is a longer conversation, and we can help with that. Most NiCad is industrial batteries right now, but there's still some historic uses that might be seen as portable, and they're banned. Perfect. Well, thanks again for attending, and everybody should hear from us pretty soon with the slides, and I look forward to hosting everyone again soon.